Thank you, Joey. I was appreciating the music, Barbara. I think that we could use a little bit more ambient piano in Temple. And we'll give people like, I don't know, 2 minutes to come in. But I'm so happy to see you all. That's nice. You always, it's like throwing a party, you're always worried that no one will show up and that you'll be stuck with all this like pizza and chips. And I'm glad that you're here and we can share a meal of the mind together. I find that after 7 p.m. I get a little bit slap happy. So I'm glad this meeting is being recorded. That's totally cool, Barbara. Thank you for letting me know. Shalom, shalom, Mrs. Toback. You have like 60 more seconds, ready and raring to go. Oh, spotlighted is nice. So in the name of beginning, let's begin. Just a few words about where the source material comes from and how we got to this place where I'm teaching you a course on Neo-Hasidut, on Neo-Hasidism here at Temple Beth El. I fell into some really interesting communities when I was studying in New York City. And I think that especially with many of the scholars that I met in my time there at places like B'nai Jeshurun and people at JTS were particularly interested in this Hasidic movement and the most recent formulation, which we call Neo-Hasidism. When it came time to choose a topic for my thesis, I said that I wanted to study something that was really alive, something that felt like it was still in formation and thereby when I was studying, I would also be playing a role in writing a history. And it's really, after over 100 pages of work, I'm happy to say that I think that there's so much more to be written. And I look forward to building on this work, not only in the next couple of years, but decades and beyond. But I think that in the name of it, it is a very long work that I've sort of condensed into this introductory session. This is my first time teaching Neo-Hasidism in this way, so I look forward to your feedback and to kind of like figuring out a better way to do this, or at least a more streamlined way. Because I realize that at least today it might feel like I'm giving you a lot of information, but at this point, with the amount of study I've done and how to get from here to there seems to me to be a circuitous path anyway. So there will be a lot of setup for something that I predict that over the course of the next hour or hour and 10 minutes, maybe we'll eventually get to Neo-Hasidism. We'll eventually get to that promised land, but the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness. And you may be wondering to yourself, saying, why haven't I heard of Neo-Hasidism? Like I went to religious school and I come to Torah study at Temple, and why is this like a new word for me? Perhaps it's not, but if it is, you might be interested to know that Michael A. Meyer, who's a historian of the Reform movement, he portrayed the early Reformed thinkers as divided in many theological and religious issues, some of them important and perhaps some less so, but there was really one thing that they could all get behind. There was one philosophy that they could all sort of join hands and sing kumbaya about. It was this rationalism that defined the early Reform movement. And it was that rationalism and the use of scholarship to study religion that laid the groundwork for the contemporary Judaism that we know today as Reform Judaism. Like, we as Reform Jews are indebted to those early Wissenschaft and Judentum Jews, those scholars who said, well, where exactly does the Bible come from, and what is religious practice really? And that sort of work really allows us today to be thoughtful and mindful in the way that we do this process of what Eugene Borowitz called choice through knowledge. And so a central assumption in this commitment to rationalism is predicated on a rejection of mysticism in all its forms. And perhaps because they were Jewish rationalists, they were particularly, if you're going to reject mysticism and you're Jewish, you have to reject Kabbalah. So now you might be thinking to yourself, what is Kabbalah? Well, Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism. And among the many threads in the tapestry of Judaism, there's this one thread that we want to talk about tonight, this Kabbalistic thread of the mystical tradition. And it's concerned with uncovering the hidden mysteries of reality beyond perception through the removal of the obscuring veil of individual consciousness. So now, what does that mean? Rahel Elior, who's a scholar of Hasidism and Jewish mysticism more broadly, relates Jewish mysticism to being a secret theological and cosmological system that adds hidden structure, inner sense, depth, flexibility, and secret meaning to a revealed reality. A reality that is assumed not to be the subject to any change. That means that there is a reality beyond our individual perception that through certain mystical practices, we can actually uncover. That there's a reality out there, a truth out there, a bigger oneness of a bigger oneness that we can all point to and say that there's something beyond myself, that there's something that is pervasive in the universe, that it predates me and will be here long after I'm gone. And mysticism, Jewish mysticism, particularly called Kabbalah, is interested in that work of uncovering that reality. So now we get into, okay, we understand Kabbalah, we understand a little bit what Jewish mysticism is trying to do. We have to get into parsing this word, which I presented you with this evening, of Neo-Hasidism. The neo, of course, being from the Greek, a prefix which indicates something is new or renewed. And Hasidism, a little bit more complicated. Okay, so the basic etymology of the word Hasid functions as a demonstration of the pursuit of that holiness that is above and beyond the letter of the law. The linguistic root, if we look at the linguistic root of Hasid, we'll see it's Chet, Samech, Yud, Daled. It's very close to, you might even say it shares a root with a word we know and love to use here at Temple Bethel, Chesed. Chesed meaning loving kindness. So it's almost as if this word Hasid is describing one who demonstrates loving kindness, perhaps to one's fellow human beings, and perhaps also one who demonstrates loving kindness, Chesed, to God. So we have a few uses of Hasid in the Tanakh. I'm gonna hopefully share my screen effectively here and give you the first one. Oh, look, there's a title page. The first mention of Hasidism in the Bible and the Torah, and the only mention in the Torah, I should say, comes to us from the very last Parshat Zot HaBracha, at the end of Deuteronomy. Timaicha u'archa li'ish hasidecha. And of Levi, he said, let your Thumi with Hasid is translated here as faithful one. We'll see also that there's other references that come in the prophets, and there's also a preponderance of references to Hasid or Hasidim in the writings, mostly concentrated in the book of Psalms, especially those Psalms that we associate with a genre of praise. If we look in JPS, which we'll do in 1 second, I promise you, we'll find this one word, Hasid, translated as here faithful, other places devoted, other places godly, or maybe even pious. So let's look at another reference in the Tanakh. So we have one here from Psalms 18:26. With the loyal, you deal loyally. So here we have in Hasid, hid hasad. You know, that Hasid in this sense is being translated as loyally. Interesting. So all at once, before loyal, faithful, we can parse the English there, but it's all going back to this one Hebrew word, Hasid, which has a root of, as I said before, chesed. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't talk to you for a second while we have the psalm up on the screen to say that this is a really beautiful formulation, that we see the way that the psalmist uses Hebrew poetry to take that same root Hasid and hid hasad, which is the reflexive form of that same root. We can have a whole nother course. Maybe we'll talk about that sometime, about the poetry of the Psalms and the way it makes me feel things. We shouldn't say that it's only in Psalms. We also, it's not only in the Torah and the Ketuvim, it's not only in the Ta and the Ach of the Tanakh, it's also in the Nevi'im, that Na right there in the middle. So go make this proclamation to the north and say, turn back, O rebel Israel, declares the Lord. I will not look on you in anger, for I am compassionate. Ki Hasid ani. So here again, we have Hasid translated a little bit differently, perhaps with the connotation of compassion, which I don't know, you'd have to ask another rabbi to see if chesed can be compassionate. I would think rachamim, but just to show you the versatility of this word, and that kind of gets borne out in the English, but even more so we see it in the variety of contexts. We have Hasid referring to human beings, we have Hasid referring to God, and it's all kind of in this context of we got to figure out what all this has to do with chesed, what it all has to do with loving kindness. I hate to complicate it for you, but this word continues to be used after the Tanakh. By the time we get to the Mishnah, we have the first reference here I brought you. The first reference to Hasidim in the Mishnah is to describe a particularly pious people. Maybe we'll I hate to make anyone else read at this late at night, but if we have a volunteer of someone who would like to read, this would be a good time to raise your voice and to give me a little break. Rabbi Mac.
One may only stand and begin to pray from an approach of gravity and submission. There's a tradition that the early generations of pious men would wait 1 hour in order to reach the solemn frame of mind appropriate for prayer, and then pray, so that they would focus their hearts towards Hamakom, or towards God.
Exactly. And it even feels like a different lens here. So perhaps when we're looking at Hasid in the context of the Torah, we see that it's got a certain quality of godliness to it. God is using it to refer to God's self, or we have a faithfulness aspect, that those who are faithful to God will have God in turn be faithful to them. By the time we get to the Mishnah, it feels like there's it's less directed towards God and more, in fact, directed towards human beings. It's more we're trying to figure out here where the turning point is, that piety is no longer reserved just for God or for, the psalmist, who, depending on who you understand the writer of the Psalms to be, is like these incredibly holy people. At this point, we even turn it, and the rabbis claim it for themselves and say that there were these early pious people, these early Hasidim. What define them as Hasidim? Well, they would do this thing where they would wait an entire hour before prayer so that they could reach the proper frame of mind. I find it hard to believe. I mean, I have a hard time arriving 5 minutes early for prayer. An hour before prayer feels like a lot, but whatever we may feel about that, it's worth saying that, like, this Hasid is defined by their action, by their desire to draw close to God, to give that prayer, that conversation with God, if that's what we understand prayer to be, a little bit of extra gravity. We have another reference in the Mishnah that comes to us from Sukkah. And the pious and the men of action would dance before the people who attended the celebration, that celebration being the celebration of Sukkot, with flaming torches that they would juggle in their hands. They would say before them passages of song and praise to God. So these Hasidim are not only concerned with their individual action, but here we see that they're actually performing necessary communal needs. I mean, they're the ones who are doing the dancing, and they're the ones who are providing the sanctification of this holiday. We're getting a little bit closer. I'd like to think that we're getting a little bit closer here. I should say that even though these are from the Mishnah, which was redacted around the 2nd century CE. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so I can see you all. It makes me feel better. That this word Hasid, Hasidim, is being used outside of the context of the traditional, or at least the, we'll call it the canon of the rabbinic tradition. The ascetics of Qumran identified themselves with the term. They called their desert fortress, where we got those Dead Sea Scrolls you hear so much about. They called that fortress the fortress of the Hasidim. And by the time we get to the Talmud, a couple hundred years later, we start to see the crystallization of Hasid, meaning someone who goes above and beyond the letter of the law. I know I just stopped sharing my screen, but that was only for a moment. Here, I'll give it to you again. We have here an explanation of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the teacher of Rabbi Eliezer. In all his days, he never engaged in idle conversation, and he never walked 4 cubits without engaging in Torah study and without donning phylacteries, tefillin. And no person ever preceded him into the study hall. And he never slept in the study hall, neither substantial sleep nor even a brief nap. And he never contemplated matters of Torah in alleyways filthy with human excrement, as doing so is a display of contempt for the Torah. And he never left anyone in the study hall and exited. And no person ever found him sitting and silent, i.e. inactive. He was always sitting and studying. And only he opened the door for his students, which was disregarding his own eminent standing. And he never said anything that he did not hear from his teacher. And he never said to his students that the time has arrived to arise and leave the study hall, except on Passover Eves, when they were obligated to sacrifice the Paschal lamb, and Yom Kippur Eves, when there's a mitzvah to eat and drink abundantly. The Gemara relates that the sages said about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that he did not neglect the Bible, Mishnah, Gemara, Halachot, and Agadot, minutia of the Torah and the minutia of scribes, the hermeneutical principles of the Torah with regard to a fortiori inferences and verbal analogies, the calculation of the calendrical seasons, the numerology, gematriot, and in addition, he did not neglect esoteric matters, including the the conversation of the ministering angels, or the conversation of demons, and the conversation of palm trees, parables of wanderers, which are folk tales that can be used to explain the Torah. There are a number of other parables that he concerns himself with. And I bring you that extensively long quote just to show you that, like, to be a Hasid was not to just like be able to call yourself one. It's not even just arriving an hour early for study or prayer. You can see from that list of attributes identified with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that it's really, there's a whole litany of things that one must do to be considered a Hasid. And whether we take that to mean faithful or pious or displaying some sort of exemplary loving kindness, the fact of the matter is it's not so simple. It's going above and beyond the letter of the law. We kick the can down the road a little bit further. A few centuries later, we have Yehudai ben Nachman Gaon, who's at that time the head of the Babylonian Academy in Sura. And he does something really amazing. He starts to connect the mystical endeavor, Kabbalah, to the ethical practice of tshuva. And it's this moral reinterpretation of mystical experience that is kind of the codifying of what we would only find beforehand in something called Hechalot literature. Now, Hechalot literature is not part of our canon. It's not anything that we would read, but in fact, it is a set of mystical texts concerned with the ways that one can enter the Hechal, the palace of God, while still here on earth. We have a special name that we would ascribe to those particular mystics of the early centuries in the Common Era. We would call them the Yoredei Merkava because they practice something called Merkava mysticism. And you may ask yourself, what is Merkava mysticism? What is a Merkava? Well, a Merkava is a chariot, and it's a nod to the mystical vision of Ezekiel, wherein he has this encounter with God, not in the land of Israel, as many other encounters with God would have you think, but actually on the rivers of Babylon. And to be able to have mystical experience there spoke, I'm sure, in a very real way to the sages of Pumbedita and Sura, because they themselves were not sitting in the land of Israel. They're trying to have connection to God, to find these mystical experiences in a place that's not, that holiness can't be taken for granted in the same way that it could in Jerusalem, let's say. The only way that one can do this Hechalot mysticism, this to become a Yored Merkava, is with lots of practices which Yehudai ben Nachman Gaon recorded in his work. So he talks about the different ways that one could achieve the proper mindset. He doesn't talk about sitting an hour before prayer, but rather for fasting for days to get into the proper mindset where one could finally attain the necessary focus to have this sort of mystical encounter with God. About 200 years later, we have another Gaon, Hai ben Shura Gaon, who was the head of not Sura but Pumbedita, which is, if there are Harvard and Yale of Babylonia, one of them would be Sura and the other one Pumbedita. Depending on who you talk to and whether they went to Harvard or Yale, I'm sure that they would have thoughts about who would go to where. But so Hai ben Shura Gaon was the head of the Pumbedita Babylonia Academy, and he recorded his own understandings. He built on the work of Yehudai ben Nachman Gaon, and he recorded his own set of practices that a Yored Merkava could use. And he included not only ascetic fasting, but he coupled that with peculiar postures that one would, after taking on these days-long fast, sit with their head between their knees and undertake a certain style of breathing, and in that way would be able to have the necessary focus to undergo a mystical experience, to have an encounter with the divine. But it was never only about these practices. That's what I want to highlight here with these, with the Gaonim, with the Babylonian Gaonim, with the geniuses, as we would translate that maybe. It's the pairing of these aesthetic practices with moral practices. And that it's not just the moral practices that you find recorded in the codes, it's not just that you would keep the Torah perfectly, it's that you actually go beyond the letter of the law. And if I can keep on hammering home that phrase, it's beyond the letter of the law. These are people who saw all 613 commandments and said, not enough. Let's build our fence around the Torah a little bigger. Let's do a little bit more so that we can really attain the necessary piety to have encounters with the divine, which is laudable. But Hybrid Shurgon really is the beginning of a certain, let's call it a genre of rabbinic literature called Sifrut HaMusar. Sifrut HaMusar being like the books of Musar, of virtues isn't a great translation, but certain the measures of oneself. So like this Sifrut HaMusar was basically these ethical tracts. And if you listen to Joseph Dan, who was the head of the mysticism department at Hebrew University in Jerusalem for years, he would tell you that Sifrut HaMusar is in fact an ethical mystical literature, and that the author's intention was to facilitate the socio-ethical as well as religious cultivation of their audience. You should read these books and in fact become a better person. For this particular authorship, those of the Sifrut HaMusar, the mystical devotional life had necessary practical implications. The pursuit of virtue within this context, in a sense, is synonymous with the pursuit of spiritual perfection and mystical experience. The only way that you can get to that spiritual experience is through the attainment of spiritual perfection. And the only way to get there is actually in the way that we behave in Ben Adam LaAdam, like the way that we behave in our interpersonal relationships. Fast forward another 100 years. By the time we're in the 11th century, you have Bachya Ibn Pakuda produce what is quite possibly my favorite work of rabbinic literature, Duties of the Heart. It's a masterpiece of Sifrut HaMusar. It's a way that Bachya, who's living in the context of strict rationalism and philosophy, tries to transcend his contemporary circumstances in order to recapture this latent spirituality of the Jewish tradition. And he does so by differentiating the duties of the heart, which are those actions which we do that are characterized by the absence of physicality. They're not about what you do, but rather how you do them. They're those actions that one undertakes with intentionality. And he separates those duties of the heart from the duties of the limbs, which is the corollary of halakha, the duties of the limbs being like the thou shalt and thou shalt nots of the world. And it's not really important, your intention, it's rather just that you would do them. Bach's construction of the duties of the heart is really itself a Hasidic innovation because it goes beyond the letter of the law. It says that, like, okay, there's these duties of the limbs, which are the letter of the law. And I'm saying to you, dear reader, that we should actually have this other thing called duties of the heart, that we should be operating with intentionality, that we should really infuse our practice not only with what is the right practice, but to go beyond that and say, like, what is the intentional practice? Bach is in effect saying to us that the religious experience cannot be fully realized in the totality of the law itself. So it's a super legal text, and I mean like that it's beyond the law. And his articulation, Bach's articulation of the extra legal principles of tradition is called by some scholars, I'll give you a name of David Blumenthal, among others, they call this intellectual mysticism or philosophical mysticism. And it's actually really interesting that we can probably draw a direct line between the work of Bachya and the contemporary work of Sufi mystics of the Islamic variety at the same time. One day you'll walk into my office and I'll hand you a book about Abraham Maimonides, who is the grandson of Moses Maimonides, and talk to you all about how Cairo in the 13th century was a happening place where philosophy and mysticism lived together in peace and harmony. But that'll be another day. Because I brought him up, Moses Maimonides. We have to think about Moses Maimonides to give him a one-line throwaway sentence about the things that he's done, not only for rabbinic literature, but for the Jewish people, would be a real disservice. And I'm going to do that disservice to him by just saying that the first thing that he publishes, and we should say that he was only 21 years old when he publishes the Mishneh Torah, which is in effect a disentangling of the plain sense of the law from generations upon generations of layered Talmudic discussion. Maimonides, at the age of 21, basically said the Talmud is too long and too complicated, and I understand it. So I'm going to take the essence of it and give it to you on a silver platter. At 21 years old, and here I am thinking of what I was doing at 21. Wow. So Maimonides is essentially building on what Alfasi, who and probably a generation earlier had started to do, which is to try and clarify what the halakha of the Talmud actually is. If you read a page of Talmud, then you would say to yourself, what did I just read? If you read a page of Talmud and try and figure out what the law is, you would say, I don't know. So that's why the academies of Sura and Pumbedita back in Babylonia made so much money for a long time, because they were able to charge you and essentially say, send me your great questions on the Talmud and we'll disentangle it for you, and you'll have a ruling that has some sort of weight and value to it. So you can imagine how they felt when Moses Maimonides at the age of 21 said, actually, you don't need to send your letters to Babylonia anymore. You can just read my book. Rather than paying all this money, I'll give you the whole law right here, right now. It's not hyperbole to quote here Moshe Halratal, who said that Rambam being Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, sought to create in the Jewish world, sought to create in the Jewish world a substantive shift in Jewish religious consciousness. People could actually, thanks to the Mishneh Torah, take the law into their own hands. And it was in service of this goal of creating a substantive shift in Jewish consciousness that Maimonides included a really peculiar section in his legal code, one that doesn't have any direct corollary in the Talmud, called human dispositions. It's in the book of reason or knowledge, Sefer Mada. And therein, Maimonides undertakes a discussion of the individual differences of humanity. It's not that thou shalt or thou shalt not, but it's much more in the spirit of what Bachya Ibn Bakuda was saying, and trying to figure out, well, what is the intentionality, the proper intentionality to live a Jewish life? And here I'll share my screen again and give you a source, so you don't think I'm making it up. So Maimonides here in the Mishneh Torah, the very first chapter of this section on human dispositions, writes, every person whose tendencies are mean tendencies of the middle course is called wise. Whether being a hacham, one who controls himself with increased restrictions and distances himself even from the mean tendency a little to one way or a little to the other way, is called devout. Devout here being a translation of chassid. How may one do it? One who will distance himself from the extreme point of arrogance and become exceedingly humble is called chassid, devout, for this is the tendency of chassidim, piety. If one distances himself to the mean point and practices meekness, he is called an ish chacham, a wise man, for this is the tendency of wisdom. A like pathway exists in all the rest of the tendencies. The ancient devotees diverged their tendencies from the middle path, facing the two extremes. Some tendency they bend to the opposite to the last extreme, and some tendency they bend opposite the first extreme. This is more than being within the limits of the law. There that phrase comes up again. More than being within the limits of the law. As for us, we are charged to walk in this middle path. which are the straight and good paths, even as it is said, and thou shalt walk in God's ways. So we see here that Maimonides is not necessarily, he's not understanding to be a Hasid as a good thing. He's saying, well, the proper way to be is actually to find the middle path, is actually to not be too much one way or the other way. But he acknowledges that there are those who are going to be increasingly stringent in the way that they operate. They're going to be Hasidim, Hasids. And again, I want to emphasize that like Maimonides acknowledges that and actually he wags his finger a little bit and says, that's like not the right way to be. That we should be looking for that shvil hazahav. You can probably thank his engagement with Aristotle for that shvil hazahav, that middle way. But in any case, he acknowledges that there are those who are gonna control themselves even more than the letter of the law. Well, there are those who are doing so, and they don't necessarily live in Sfarad. They're living in Ashkenaz. They're living in, let's call it, well, I guess today we'd call it Germany. So there are communities there in what we today would call Germany who are developing totally outside of the context of the philosophical traditions which Bachya, Ibn Kuda, and Moses Maimonides had to engage in by the virtue of their context. Their adherence and their commitment to the halachic framework, while assuredly not perfect, and the circumstances which surrounded them demanded that they constantly be ready to lay down their lives for the sake of Kiddush Hashem, for the sake of the sanctification of God's name. In the shadow of the Crusades, medieval German Jewry came to embody the ethos of the Hasid articulated by the Mishnah and later Rambam, of that stringent piety, of that going beyond the letter of the law, and thus they are known today to us by the moniker the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the Hasidim of Ashkenaz. Now, it might sound like they were very active for a long time, but I want to emphasize here that it was really a small, short period of creativity for the Hasidei Ashkenaz, really from 1150 to 1250. They were intimately connected with the whole of Jewish life and the religious interests of the common folk. They're different from the rest of the Jewish mystical tradition because rather than trying to hold on to this esoteric knowledge, they sought to strip the centuries-old veil of secrecy and thereby public disseminate what had formerly been confined to really only these very learned esoteric circles. There were three defining figures of this movement of the Hasidei Ashkenaz: Samuel the Hasid, Judah the Hasid, and Elazar ben Judah. All of them come from the same family. They're all of the Kalamos family, who, although they're writing in medieval Germany, originally come from Italy. And these three Hasidei Ashkenaz define the landscape of German Jewish scholarship from then on. The work attributed to these three people would be Sefer Hasidim. There, that word comes up again, Hasidim. Gershom Shalom, who also taught at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem mysticism, described Sefer Hasidim as the most important literary monument of the movement. So while there may have been other tracts written by Hasidei Ashkenaz, if you only would read one, Shalom would say that you should read the Sefer Hasidim. I don't want you to think that it's only these medieval German Jews who are engaged in the work of Hasidism. Meanwhile, in Sfarad, not necessarily the Sfarad of Moses Maimonides, who by that point has migrated to Egypt to become a doctor. I mean, he was always a doctor, but at that point he's the doctor to the Sultan. At the same time, there are people who are trying to reclaim the mystical tradition in their own way in Sfarad, particularly in Christian Spain. One of them you'll know as Ramban, not Rambam, but Ramban, not Maimonides, but Nachmanides. And he's the first one to introduce mystical or mysticism, mystical ideas, into his commentary on the Torah. According to Elliot Wolfson, perhaps no figure is more responsible for the legitimization of Kabbalah as an authentic esoteric tradition of Judaism. So Kabbalah has been like floating around this whole time, but what Nachmanides really does is by putting it in his Torah commentary, which is vast and discusses not only Kabbalah, but practical Judaics and everything else in between, he's essentially saying that it's okay that we can talk about Kabbalah. We can actually engage with the study of it and not be considered beyond the pale. Another great legitimizer of the Kabbalah in that time and place is Bachya ben Asher, another Bachya, not Bachya Bakuda, but ben Asher. He's known to us by the very confusing title Rabbeinu Bachya, not the other Rabbeinu Bachya, but this Rabbeinu Bachya. He gives us what we would take for granted these days, which is a fourfold method of interpretation, that which we know as Pardes, Pshat, Drash, Remez, and Sod. Pshat being the plain sense of the text, Drash being the homiletical interpretation, Remez being the hint or the philosophical sense, and Sod, which is that Kabbalah, the mystical sense of the text. And he redacts his commentary. He finishes it in Zaragoza, Spain, around the year 1291. According to Joseph Dan again, from a historical point of view, the most successful solution to the problem of spiritualization was achieved by the new conception of the meaning of the commandments developed by the early Kabbalists, which was most forcefully expressed in, drumroll, the Zohar. Now, we could have a whole class on the Zohar by itself. Another class to talk about how it is the product of its context in medieval Christian Spain, and there's all sorts of Itzhak Baird did a really interesting comparison of the itinerant Franciscan monks who were walking around at the time and how that influenced the Zoharic author's conception of mysticism. Another class for another day. We'll put it away for today. We'll say that the Zohar and these mystical commentaries which are drawing on the Zohar, so when you read Nachmanides or you read Bachya ben Asher, when you read Rabbeinu Bachya, and they're talking about the Sod, those secrets, those Kabbalistic secrets, many of them we can find corollaries in the Zohar. Again, because it's a different class, I'll only tease that, well, the Zohar was probably not inherited as a full text, and rather there were all these different teachings, these mystical teachings floating around that are eventually compiled and redacted by a guy by the name of Moshe de Leon. I'm going to stop talking about the Zohar because it's too interesting to get lost in. I'm going to transport you. The year is 1492, and you, living in Spain as a Jew, are about to not live in Spain anymore. So, or, convert or die. I'm sure that was also the other two options here. So the Spanish Inquisition forces a diaspora, and I want to use that word intentionally, that they did feel like they were in the promised land when they were in Spain. They felt like they could live the lives they wanted to live, and there was a forced diaspora by the Inquisition that sent them, ironically, to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. So the cognitive dissonance of feeling unrooted in what's supposed to be your homeland, we can only imagine. But in those centuries following the expulsion from Spain, there's a new center of Jewish mysticism, which we call Tzfat. And Tzfat becomes the focal point for the revival of Kabbalah. It was that reconvening point for the Jewish mystical tradition, which had formed all over the world and sort of all coalesces in Eretz Israel. It's refracted through that lens of being in Eretz Israel, being in the Promised Land. We get from these Sfadian, which is the way that you say, dealing with Sfat, Sfadian, love it. One of the primary scholars that comes out of Sfat is Rabbi Joseph Caro. famous to you perhaps from his commentary on Rabbi Jacob Asher's Arba Turim. Maybe you've heard of the Shulchan Aruch. So he's writing these tracks, these codes in Sfat, and he's doing so being driven by his own mystical experiences. And he details those mystical experiences in a work called the Magid Mesharim. In that book, in that little diary-like compendium, the Magid Mesharim, Caro talks about being influenced by his mentor, who is none other than the personified Mishnah. So Caro is learning these Hiddushim, these new interpretations of the law from the Mishnah itself, which is about as authoritative as having my smicha on the wall behind me. Another primary innovation of this new blended Kabbalah, blended because it's not only it's blending the Hasidei Ashkenaz with the Hasidim of Sfat, with the Hasidim who had been already living in the land of Israel. So another innovation would be that at this point in Sfat, in the 16th century, the Kabbalah takes on a new weight. It takes on a messianic weight. Why are we doing these things? It's not only about having encounters with God. Now it's about so that we can be redeemed, so that like the Messiah will come and Olam Haba will be present here on earth. Beyond messianism, the three characteristic ideals of Lurianic Kabbalah, called Lurianic Kabbalah because one of the progenitors of the movement is Isaac Luria. The three characteristic ideals which will have the most effect on later Jewish mysticism, especially Hasidism, are Tzimtzum, which is a withdrawal or contraction. Like when God created the earth, there was this Tzimtzum that God had to do, this contraction that God had to do, so there was room for the world to be created. It also is a really helpful way to deal with theodicy, with the problem of evil. Why can bad things happen if God is everywhere? Well, God had to do a little bit of Tzimtzum. God is actually, not necessarily everywhere. Well, the second would be Shvira, breaking or shattering. So as a product of this Tzimtzum, there's unnecessary breaking of, it's easiest to say God's self breaks, and there are these little pieces of light that are scattered throughout the world, and that comes to the last of these three characteristic ideals, which is tikkun, the restoration, the repair of those broken shards, and the return to uplifting them back to their source. The Kabbalists of Sfat adopted this ethos, and they in your writings, you can see a synthesis of theoretical and practical Kabbalah. So there's both these practices, which we saw in the Yoredei Merkava, as well as sort of the more heady ideals of the philosophical Kabbalists. And it produces its own brand of ethical literature. And they even create their own system of a spherotic realm. And the Sphirot, again, could be their own class. I mean, like this is the joy of writing at a certain point, is that so many of the things that I touched on in this work, which you can find online, is could be their own works, could be monographs unto themselves, and could be courses unto themselves. And God willing, I'll have a very long career here and we can talk about everything in its own time. Now we're sort of moving in that direction of Hasidism. I brought it up. I said the word. So the presumptive inheritor of the ethical mystical chain of tradition after Sfat was Ashkenaz. It was specifically the Eastern European Polish Jewry. Why? Because many of the Sfadian Kabbalists make their way up into Poland for any number of reasons, which we could get into in a history class. But I want to, for a moment, pick out the 17th century sage Isaiah ben Abraham Horowitz, who produced a work of Musar called the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the two tablets of the covenant, which, although it's primarily produced in the land of Israel, is reflective of the contemporary Ashkenazi culture of the 17th century. And it is also demonstrative of Horowitz's ability to do some really amazing wielding and interweaving of a wide variety of strains of rabbinic tradition. Despite the arrival of Kabbalah, or the next stop, let's say, of Kabbalah being in Poland, there's a charismatic figure known as Shabtai Tzvi, who harnesses those latent messianic aspirations of the people that ascribe to the Lurianic Kabbalah. And because those aspirations that Shabtai Tzvi would himself be the Messiah turned out to be false, he was, eventually converted to Islam, and beyond that, had some sort of antinomian understandings of the way that mystical tradition could be practiced. It really created a culture of suspicion around Kabbalah. And it's that culture of suspicion in which the Baal Shem Tov is born into. The trauma of Sabbateanism and its false messiah contributed to the suspicion held by Jewish scholars in the 18th century. But even though we can say that many of the scholars said were now wary of Kabbalah, but I want to emphasize that now that the laity had Kabbalah in their hands, as it were, now that they had been given the tools to practice themselves, I submit to you that they did. And that even though the scholarship at the time was really wary of Kabbalah, that people were still interested in it and still trying to wield it and use it. So let's get into the Baal Shem Tov, who is a name that I'm sure many of us recognize. And the true nature of the Baal Shem Tov is the subject of a lot of academic debate. There's been so much ink spilled on whether the Baal Shem Tov even existed. What I can tell you is that we have Polish tax records that indicate that there was an individual referred to by various Polish, Ukrainian governmental iterations that recorded an individual called the Baal Shem, or sometimes the Baal Sem, or sometimes Baal Tsam or Baal Tsam doctor, living rent and tax-free in a house owned by the community of Mezhebudge being in Podolia, modern-day Ukraine. His status as the progenitor of Hasidism and as an enigmatic character defying definition has elicited countless portrayals seeking to understand his mission and to attach various agenda to it. From the time of his death, Hasidic roots have sought legitimacy and prominence by way of their connection to him, to the Baal Shem Tov. And Neo-Hasidism has been deeply involved in the process of creativity and recapturing and reimagining the essence of the Baal Shem Tov's teaching in order to establish itself within the framework of Jewish tradition, while also innovating in the modern world. In order to gain appreciation for the project and processes of Neo-Hasidism, we have to understand that context of the Hasidic movement. The fathers of Neo-Hasidism utilized the space created by the central tension concerning the scope and intention of the mission of the best in order to define it in terms of renewal and rediscovery rather than innovation. Because the best didn't do much writing, it was quite possible to say, well, the actual intention of this charismatic figure was, in fact, much more universal than it had been applied in other Hasidic movements or other Hasidism of that time. Let's now that we've talked about the Besh a little bit, well, I'll take a moment to share another screen. let's see, a parable from the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem said, imagine a man whose business hounds him though through many streets and across the marketplace all the livelong day. He almost forgets that there is a maker of the world. Only when the time for the afternoon prayer comes does he remember, I must pray. And then, from the bottom of his heart, he heaves a sigh of regret that he has spent the day on vain and idle matters. And he runs into a by street and stands there and prays. God holds him very dear, and his prayer pierces the firmament. So this story displays three major spiritual innovations which we attribute to the Besht, and they're actually what makes people so upset by the Besht when he first comes onto the scene. These innovations are that the divine presence is actually accessible everywhere, first and foremost, even in the marketplace, and also by everyone, even this exceedingly busy man. Accessibility of the hidden divine realm is available not just to the learned, to the scholars, to the mystic, but actually to everyone in the community. And finally, this story shows us that there's a conception of equality among all the modes of divine worship. It's actually just as good to think about praying and then to go do it from the bottom of your heart as it is to study all day. This is unlike any of the other movements at the time. So much of our knowledge about the Besht is gleaned from stories such as this one, and also in collections and aphorisms that are attributed to the Besht. I'll let Elie Wiesel say that the Besht was obsessed with eternity, he neglected history, and let himself be carried by legend. The works attributed to him, Shivchei HaBesht, Keter Shem Tov, and Sabat HaRivash, really belong to others. Unlike many other Jewish leaders, Israel Eliezer Baal Shem Tov never wrote a book himself. Never, not one. But he had more than 1,400 books written about him. And in that way, we can kind of see that this enigmatic figure inspires not only one movement, but I make the case that that movement then inspires another and another. And we'll begin to see that as we start to see the seeds of Neo-Hasidism. The seeds being first probably expressed in the Sfat Emet, who was, the Sfat Emet is what we call Rabbi Yehuda Leib Alter, because of his essential treatise on the Torah, his commentary, which he published around, we'll say between 1905 and 1908, depending on which version you take. It's the magnum opus of his teachings and really the essential companion for any ger chassid, anyone who would count themselves among that ilk. So the Sfat Emet is like a compilation of all of these teachings that he gave over the course of those years. And it doesn't really have, it might share a unified ideology. Really, you could read the whole thing and say this was the same person who had the same ideas throughout, but what's different in the multiple years, and it's really cool to see these multiple years of commentary stacked up on top of each other, because it's really evident in style that the Sfat Emet's earlier writings, juxtaposed with later writings, kind of display that the earlier writings are much more rigorous. They're more difficult to understand. They're written in a higher tenor. And his later writings are much more accessible. The distinction could be indicative of the growth of the community during his tenure, but really we should consider it a Neo-Hasidic development in its own right, because it sought to make the tradition more accessible. It sought to make it more accessible to more people and removed or reframed some of the more esoteric elements of the tradition. The Kabbalistic means, the languages and symbols of the Sfat Emet were employed to serve moral and psychological ends. When he's offering a mystical insight, he uses simple and more universally understood language so as to be clear and direct. This universalizing endeavor to transmit his ideas beyond the Hasidic world. The Spot Emet is also Neo-Hasidic work in its ability to rediscover and reframe earlier mystical sources for modern needs. It's very similar to what we might consider the Besh endeavor, but with more fluidity and nuance palatable to other Jewish groups. So you don't have to be a Hasid to appreciate the Spot Emet's teachings. You can really be a Jew who is entirely secular or entirely steeped in the study houses of Lithuania and appreciate that his work is speaking to you. Another seed of Neo-Hasidism we should identify is Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, known as Rav Cook, lived from 1865 to 1935, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of British Mandatory Palestine. And he was a necessary precursory figure to the development and spread of Neo-Hasidism for a few reasons. He had a desire to shift, stretch, and extend the existing paradigm in the ways that were particularly fertile for Jewish religious and cultural endeavors in and beyond the land of Israel. He was much more willing to take in teachings from non-Jewish sources and to incorporate them into his own work. And he did this as the chief rabbi of Israel, chief rabbi of British Mandatory Palestine. His flexibility as a halakhic authority was also pioneering in that he advocated for a vision of halakha which was both authentic and amenable to the modern world. His conception of the Jewish project was fundamentally towards being Jewish is really about taking steps towards a universal good, rather than the antagonistic stance towards competing ideologies that typified many of his contemporaries. He sought understanding of and cooperation with all of these other ideologies as a means of revealing aspects of the all-encompassing nature of God. And actually, he's the first one to coin the term Neo-Hasidism. He didn't say Neo-Hasidism. I shouldn't say he coined the term. What he did do was he advocated for what he called a great Hasidism, a very superior Hasidism, a great Hasidism unique in its greatness of knowledge which is partially encapsulated in an acronym which he used, Kemach, the initials of Kabbalah, Mada, and Hasidut, that being Kabbalah, science, and Hasidism. And he said that the synthesis of these elements would produce an understanding of real Torah. In this regard, he invoked the adage, if there is no Kemach, Kemach being an acronym for Kabbalah, science, and Hasidism, there is no Torah. And if there is no Torah, there is no Kemach. I realize right now we're at 8:02, and while I would certainly love to have another installation of this series, I also want to honor that my mom is in town for the installation and we've got dinner planned. So if anyone has any questions, I do have time for questions or anything else that they want to, what's interesting to you, not interesting. This is like feedback, comments, snide remarks, general well wishes. The floor is yours. I presented for an hour. Tell me what you thought. Tell me what you're thinking about. Must have done a really good job. You guys understand Hasidism so well.
Can I ask Rabbi Neimeiser, can you talk a little bit about how Neo-Hasidism finds its way into the world that we know, which is musically and study and congregations like BJ and right, things like that, and also if you can say something, are there women's voices in Neo-Hasidism? Because it does seem, certainly as with much of the Jewish tradition, it is purview of the male world, but I'm curious if in your studies you found that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, because I think it allows me to say that this This should really be a 3-part series. I think in the 3rd part we would talk about how it shows up in the world we know today. Without telling on myself too much, I'll say that I think that a figure who would probably be the most readily identifiable with the way that Neo-Hasidism has shown up in the world as we know it would probably be Abraham Joshua Heschel. And all of his descendants, all of his students, and people like Art Green, and all of his descendants and his students are engaged with this work of revitalizing Hasidism. In our next session, should there be a next session, we'll talk about Hillel Zeitlin and Martin Buber. And Zeitlin envisioned a Hasidism that was much more egalitarian. And he made space for women's voices in a way, and especially because Zeitlin, he tragically had his life cut short by the Holocaust. But in the Warsaw Ghetto, he assembled mixed minyanim and was teaching the secrets of Kabbalah to men and women alike. I should say also, on the other hand, Martin Buber wouldn't be interested in Hasidism if it wasn't for his wife Paula. And if you read his writing about her, I think that itself shows that so much of his work and his efforts are indebted to her. And when we read Buber and we know that she's there the whole time, that isn't quite as satisfying, but it is true. I think that also, especially if this Neo-Hasidism is trying to recapture the seeds or the best parts of the original Hasidism, the best, and to make it more universal, a large part of that universalizing endeavor has got to be the incorporation of women's voices, and also sources that are not Jewish, I should say, but that's another class. Of course. Yeah.
So I have a question. I know that I don't know if I should call them the Lubavitch or the extreme religious people in Israel make pilgrimages to the Ukraine from time to time. And is that connected to the Baal Shem Tov, or descendant of the Baal Shem Tov?
Absolutely, and thank you for bringing that up, because I think that what I could talk about more is the Hasidism introduces the idea of the tzaddik, the idea that there is this person who is, just by virtue of their being, holier than the rest of us, and that we actually channel all of our spiritual religious aspirations into that one person. And that one person, the tzaddik, is so holy that even in death, they're holier than the rest of us. So there are those pilgrimages to, let's say, Shneur Zalman of Lodi, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the original one, there to his tomb, and also to it's actually really a sad story that if we would go to Ukraine to the cemetery that the Baal Shem Tov's kever, his grave, is in, we would see this beautiful, well-kept grave of the Baal Shem Tov, and all the other graves are trampled on and not very well maintained at all. And it's sort of, it makes you scratch your head and say, what is this really serving? If the lesson wasn't that, all of humanity is sacred and holy, then well, what are we doing here? But that's why I'm interested in the Neo, the way that we can take these ideas and actually live with them in the world as we understand it and know it, and rather than sequestering ourselves in the shtetl, and I could go on, but in short, yes, that pilgrimage to the sites of holy people is true in Ukraine as well as in Israel, and you can usually tell who the holy person they're visiting is by the upkeep of that grave. I'll take the opportunity to say thank you for letting me talk about something I care about so much. It has been a pleasure and an honor, and let's keep the conversation going. Let's and probably stop this recording at some point.